David Klaus. I'm the consulting director of the Wilson Center on the Hill project. We do about 20 of these programs a year on Capitol Hill, and particularly for those of you who were out in the hall a little bit beforehand, I'd encourage you to sign up. If you haven't done so already, give us your card and ask to be put on the email list for Wilson Center on the Hill program announcements. As you saw, if you're on the list, you get in first where we have capacity issues. So I encourage you to do that. We have some programs that are coming in September, but we're actually just putting them to, sort of the details are just being worked out. So look for your email, look on your email, and we will give you the announcements of those programs in September. Briefly, for those of you who don't know it, the Woodrow Wilson Center was established in 1968. Thank you. As a living memorial to former President Woodrow Wilson, the only president who was also a PhD, and prior to coming to the presidency, he was the president of Princeton University. Congress, rather than building some large building that sort of stood there, a monument, decided to create a center for scholarship, linking public policy in the academic world, and that is the Woodrow Wilson Center, which has been operating since 1968. Today's program is a joint program with the Woodrow Wilson International Center, with the International Security Studies program, and I will shortly turn this over to Rob Litwak, who is the director of that program. As I said, the Wilson Center on the Hill project is a program that takes about 20 different programs of the Wilson Center and tries to bring that expertise and experience and thoughtfulness to Capitol Hill. Let me also say that this is a project done by, also jointly sponsored by the STAGE program at the Wilson Center, Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy. Kent Hughes over there is the director of that program. We operate through the good blessings and with the funding from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who has provided a grant that provides not only for the organization of these programs, and Elizabeth Byers, who's back there, who is the program assistant to the Wilson Center on the Hill program, who you see, but also for your lunch today. So thank you to Hewlett, the Hewlett Foundation. And with that, let me turn the program over to Rob, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to participate in today's meeting, another in the ongoing Wilson Center on the Hill that is organized by Kent Hughes and Dave Klaus. It's a pleasure to be here today. The Wilson Center is located just down in the Ronald Reagan building. We have about 700 meetings a year in that building, and we're just a short kind of metro ride away. So please do, as in the vernacular, check out our website and see what the activities that are going on virtually any day at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and join us if you are interested in any of the programming. In addition to ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, President Barack Obama inherited twin nuclear crises with North Korea and Iran. North Korea conducted its second nuclear weapons test in May 2009, while Iran continues to flout UN Security Council resolutions requiring the suspension of its uranium enrichment program, which the United States and other countries believe is central to Tehran's clandestine effort to acquire nuclear weapons. In Washington, North Korea is viewed as essentially a failed state, a defensive state, whose regime's calculus of decision is driven solely by the imperative of political survival. Despite its Iran has a less advanced nuclear weapons program, but is considered the more dynamic threat because of its extensive financial resources from oil production, its erratic president and his extremist rhetoric, and Tehran's generally destabilizing foreign policy. The nuclear crises in these two countries are playing out against the backdrop of potentially significant societal developments. In North Korea, a stroke reportedly suffered by Kim Jong Il, the dear leader, has fueled rumors of a succession crisis. While in Iran, the civil unrest that followed the contested presidential election of June 2009 exposed a major rift within the clerical leadership and undercut the regime's domestic political legitimacy. The Obama administration's dilemma is that the nuclear crises are immediate, whereas the prospects for regime change or regime evolution in these countries are uncertain. The timelines for nuclear weapons acquisition and societal change are not in sync. Now, to discuss these two hard cases, which are harder for the Obama administration than when George W. Bush became president, we're fortunate to have with us two distinguished experts. Michael Adler is a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He worked for many years as Agent France Presse, did reporting in Tehran, and many years in Vienna covering the International Atomic Energy Agency, where he really was able to observe firsthand the ins and outs of nuclear diplomacy with Iran. So we're fortunate to have him with us today. He'll be joined by Marcus Noland, who is the Deputy Director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He is one of the country's leading North Korea watchers, expert on North Korean economy, domestic politics, and he will bring to bear an authoritative kind of look from inside North Korea to the extent that one can make sense of what's going on in that opaque society, and how, in both cases, how the domestic politics will interact with the nuclear politics that the Obama administration is grappling with. So with that, teeing up of the issues, it's my pleasure to first introduce Michael Adler, who will focus on the Iran case. Michael.
The original impulse for this program was to link two major nuclear crises. It was a way of saying that nuclear concerns are central to a surprising number of global issues. In Pakistan, there are fears that atomic weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists. Improved relations with Russia hinge on the START talks to reach common ground on reducing the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. So one could say that we are in an international crisis over the spread of nuclear weapons. The tipping point may well be in Iran, a closely watched nation in a region where most everybody feels threatened. Meanwhile, Iran is going through its greatest domestic turmoil since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This is what we know. It's amazing how much less certainty there is when we delve into the Iranian nuclear crisis. Rhetoric has been consistently out of sync with the measures taken. It is a crisis the West put on a back burner once revelations surfaced in 2002 that Iran was hiding nuclear work. This is when Iran was still researching how to enrich uranium and not yet churning out large quantities of fissile material. Iran has used ambiguous interpretations about what it is doing, and the West's conviction that the day of reckoning could be put off to forge ahead with its atomic program. And so here we are. It is not certain what can be done. I would like to focus on the possibility of getting into talks, and specifically on how the U.S. is trying to do this. It is important to note that this is not the only way to go. In fact, people as diverse as Track 2 activists and the Israeli government have very different opinions on what should be done. Let's take a quick look at this. Now, the Track 2 diplomacy involves unofficial meetings with Iran, and one of the leading groups in this is led by Ambassador Thomas Pickering. And their idea is that instead of insisting that Iran suspend uranium enrichment, that we offer them a way to keep enrichment. And what they have proposed is an international consortium which would oversee what the Iranians are doing. On the other hand, the Israelis do not want to see any enrichment in Iran because they're concerned that any enrichment they do is the road towards getting nuclear weapons. And you've noticed that this week there were a lot of American officials going to Israel to visit with the Israelis. And I think one reason for this is that the Israelis are concerned that the United States might actually succeed in reaching an agreement with Iran. And they're concerned that this agreement might involve letting Iran continue enrichment work. And to the Israelis, as I said before, this is something they regard as dangerous and an existential threat. But now that we understand those two different sides about different ways about how to approach this, I'd like to go through the United States and how the landscape presents itself to the United States. First of all, Iran is continuing to enrich uranium, which can be fuel for power reactors or the core of atom bombs. But it is not clear how close Iran is to being able to make a bomb. The Israelis have given 2014 as the date when Iran could have a deliverable nuclear weapon. Others say they could have a bomb within 6 months. And meanwhile, there are real doubts about Iran's progress. Some intelligence sources say the Iranians recently had a bunch of centrifuges crash at their enrichment site in Natanz. But current setbacks aside, the Russians are much less convinced of Iran's technical prowess than are the United States and Israel. The bottom line from all this is that the U.S. estimate is that there is still time for diplomacy. Which brings us to U.S. problems in engaging the Iranians. It is not clear if the unrest in Iran will make the Iranians more hardline against talking to Washington or more hungry for a deal in order to get legitimacy for their regime. And to whom would Washington talk? Would it be the contested President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? The U.S. administration wants to talk to the people in Iran who actually control the nuclear program. The U.S. also wants to walk the fine line of not legitimizing Ahmadinejad. This leaves the United States talking to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, or most surely one of his representatives. But in the current state of play, we are nowhere near such a level of contact. What we do have is a commitment to drawing a line. President Obama said at the G8 summit in Italy earlier this month that the United States and its allies would, in September, reevaluate Iran's posture towards negotiating the cessation of a nuclear weapons policy. This is code for Iran moving towards meeting UN calls to suspend uranium enrichment. Obama avoided setting a deadline, but did state, "We also say we're not going to just wait indefinitely and allow for the development of a nuclear weapon, the breach of international treaties, and wake up one day and find ourselves in a much worse situation and unable to act." Obama did not say what he would do. We are in a gray area where the United States is trying to learn from years of diplomatic failure. Iran has since 2002 defied international pressure while assembling an industrial complex to produce enriched uranium. Now, the Iranians, we must take their point of view into account, say they are only guaranteeing the independence of their peaceful program. Indeed, Iranian officials are annoyed that the West and the UN Security Council still suspect them of wanting to make nuclear weapons. The Iranians feel that the investigation of their program should just go away. If Washington wants to impose its own take on the crisis, it will have to use three tactics to keep from being sidelined. The first is, don't let Iran off the hook. Iranian Foreign Minister Manouchehr Mottaki said in Tehran on July 11th that Iran was working on a proposal for talks. Tehran has not yet delivered the text, but signs indicate it will not address the nuclear issue. It will instead take the high road towards wider talks on political, security, and international issues. U.S. officials say this is all well and good, but that the nuclear issue must be dealt with first. This is engagement. It involves offering Iran incentives such as help with peaceful nuclear work and lifting trade barriers. It also may require flexibility in letting Iran keep some enrichment while putting up what U.S. officials call firewalls to Iran using this enrichment to make a bomb. But in the first phase, Washington insists that Iran would have to suspend enrichment for a while as a confidence-building measure. This is the scenario for successful talks. The other side of the coin is sanctions if Iran does not cooperate. Clinton has said, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, has said these would be crippling. The French want sanctions to be a game changer, to force Iran to change its behavior. But will the Russians come along with us for such tough sanctions, or will they insist that their lucrative trading ally Iran be given more time for talks? Which brings us to tactic number two. Don't be specific. This seems counterintuitive, but look at the record. The Iranian nuclear crisis is littered with red lines for taking action. The lines faded to pink and then disappeared as nothing definitive was done. Iran has made enough low-enriched uranium to be able to refine out further, if it chose to, a so-called significant quantity of highly enriched uranium, the amount needed to make one atom bomb. In the early days of this crisis, say in 2004 or 2005, it would have been inconceivable that Iran could advance so far before being shut down by some kind of sharp reaction. But now both the United States and Israel are reluctant to say at what point they would have no choice but to take drastic action. Why? The logic is that Iran would want to have low-enriched uranium for several bombs, not just one, before it realigned its centrifuge machines for weapons-grade enrichment. And then it would take a year to refine the uranium to weapons levels. Some analysts say the Iranians could do this faster, especially if they have secret sites. The U.S. is avoiding setting deadlines or threatening specific action. A European diplomat told me the West was being careful to understand the difference between aspiration and reality. The goal may be to move quickly on sanctions, but this may be difficult in a UN Security Council where Russia and Iranian oil client China have vetoes. Obama tried to get the Russians to promise him support on sanctions during a visit to Moscow just before the G8 summit. But it is not clear what pledges he got and how the Russians will act when the time comes for them to back tough measures. Despite this, tactic number 3 is have limits. Cynical observers of the West's attempts to negotiate say the table is set for yet more stalling by the Iranians. Iran has not yet fully complied with the UN nuclear investigation that began in 2003. The inquest is stalled over Tehran's refusal to answer questions about possible military work in its nuclear program. And of course, Iran refuses to suspend uranium enrichment. Iran's political crisis could, ironically, turn out to be a tool the Iranians use to win more time as they strive to put their house in order. But it is not as if the Iranians are close to striking a deal. If the Obama administration is to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapons capability, it will have to impose its own schedule. If Iran shows no readiness to compromise, Obama will have to carry through on crippling sanctions, whatever the Iranian reaction, and especially if he is to keep Israel behind his efforts. This would be a radically new development in a crisis marked by delays and international compromises that have turned stern measures into easily parried slaps on the wrist. And even with such a demonstration of determination, there is no guarantee of success in this uncertain and fluid confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here this afternoon. There is one thing in Rob's introduction that I would like to endorse, and there was one statement he made that I would like to dissent from. Rob, in his introduction, described North Korea as a failed state. And I found that very surprising and in certain ways uplifting. North Korea is an interesting case, and I think it oftentimes reveals as much about the analyst or the observer as it does about the country. My training is in economics, and from the standpoint of an economist, this is a failed state. It's an economy that collapsed years ago in the sense that it doesn't generate enough output, given the expenditure preferences of the regimes to sustain the population biologically. But from the standpoint of, say, one of my co-authors who might be a political scientist, North Korea is not a failed state. It's this crafty government that has done a remarkable job of parlaying this really weak hand into all these gains. So, and I think the remarks that I'll make over the next few minutes reflect that kind of ambiguity, that in some ways this is a failed state, and in some ways it's a state that continues to act with a great deal of effectiveness. That's the part of Rob's comments that I wanted to endorse. The part that I want to dissent from is when he described me as an expert. In the words of former Vice President Walter Mondale, anyone who tells you that they're an expert on North Korea is a liar or a fool. I try not to think of myself as either, so I never call myself an expert on North Korea. My corollary to this, which I hope I won't violate, is don't believe any number with respect to North Korea that comes with a decimal point attached. Okay, so what do we have here today? Well, as Rob mentioned in his introductory remarks, the country is in the midst of a succession process. Kim Jong Il, the leader of the country, appears to have had a stroke last year. More recently, it was rumored that he has cancer. I don't know. People often ask me, what is Kim Jong Il thinking? And I explain to them that my training is in economics, not psychiatry, and that I've never met the man, so I really don't know what he's thinking. Nor am I his personal physician, nor do I have any access to his medical records. So I can't tell you if he has cancer or not. But what I can tell you is in recent pictures, he looks really, really bad. So I think it's fair to say that there is some fairly serious medical issue at work, and you can believe what you read after that. That raises the issue of succession. All authoritarian governments face problems with succession. North Korea is a strange case. It's I guess the only example we have of dynastic communism. Kim Jong Il himself inherited power in 1994 upon the death of his father, Kim Il-sung, the founding leader of the country. He has 3 acknowledged sons. He's had a pretty active social life, and he has 3 acknowledged sons and possibly some other children as well. Probably some other children as well. And these sons are from different mothers, and there are some issues. But it appears that he has selected the youngest son, Kim Jong Un, as his successor. If Kim Jong Il were to choke on a chicken bone and die tonight, Kim Jong Un would come to power in his mid-20s, much less experienced than his father was when his father assumed power in 1994, much less experience within the North Korean system, and so on. He would probably face a very challenging environment. North Korea has had a pretty lousy 15 years under his father. They had a famine, killed probably 3 to 5% of the population. It's not a political system that probably at this point is able to tolerate a lot of underperformance. There are 3 centers of power within that system: the Kim family and its retinue, the Korean Workers' Party, and the military. And each of those groupings appears to be riven by rivalries. There's a certain degree of evidence of coalitions across them. So one can imagine a fairly complex transitional process, possibly one in which Kim Jong Un would sort of reign but not rule. There are a variety of personages within the regimes who are described as possibly in a position to assert more power. Beyond that, there are other cleavages as well. As an economist, what it becomes apparent when you look at the economy is there's basically a cleavage between the central government in Pyongyang and the lower levels of the government in the hinterland, in which local officials, at least in the economic sphere, appear to exert a fair amount of autonomy, and the economy is essentially marketized outside of state control. There's also a lot of times you hear stories about hardliners and reformers and so on. All I know is that my guess is if there are reformers, if there are people who have second thoughts or misgivings about recent courses of action, they probably, given the deep uncertainty about how the country will be governed after Kim Jong Il dies, are probably keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. And that creates an internal political dynamic, I would hypothesize, that puts unusually light brakes on regime behavior, and encourages the government to act in ways that, in some sense, reinforce or revive the old-time religion. So, in the economic sphere, for example, the most prominent economic policy over, say, the last 6 months has been the quite literal revival of a Stalinist economic program from the 1950s. The foreign policy side, as we know, there have been a series of provocations involving missile and nuclear tests. Well, so what should be done? First of all, I think we should have very modest expectations about what can be accomplished with regard to North Korea in the short run. My guess is that these internal political uncertainties have created a situation in which the North Koreans may be responding as much or more to their own internal political dynamics as they are to any external stimulus. So either carrots or sticks may have fairly limited efficacy in the short run, given their own internal political situation. I think we should hold out the possibility of constructive engagement. Our aim would be to encourage the transformation of the regime in a desirable direction, recognizing that not all forms of engagement are equally useful. And in the question and answer, I would be happy to elaborate on that. In the meantime, we have to take defensive measures, and that is how I would essentially interpret the latest round of UN security sanctions under UN Security Council Resolution 1874. And indeed, I'm actually a little surprised and disappointed. I think the U.S. government is not doing as good a job of articulating U.S. policy and its rationale in this area as it could. After the first nuclear test, the UN Security Council undertook sanctions that were at least partly punitive in nature, so-called smart sanctions aimed at the elite, trying to withhold luxury goods. I think it's clear those sanctions didn't work. There's very little in the historical record that suggests that governments are going to change core political priorities in response to economic sanctions. And if economic sanctions are to work, then they have to be sort of rigorously applied. There's no evidence that North Korea's largest trade partner, China, implemented those earlier UN sanctions, if you look at the pattern of trade between the two countries. The more recent set of sanctions, after the second nuclear test, broaden those earlier sanctions by including financial measures that were not covered before, as well as providing for more robust interdiction efforts. In effect, giving kind of international imprimatur to earlier U.S. policies under the Proliferation Security Initiative. I think those policies are unlikely to reverse the North Korean nuclear program. I think that the ultimate resolution of the North Korean nuclear weapons program will probably require a change in political regime in Pyongyang. But they could be useful in achieving a more limited set of goals having to do with proliferation. It may be possible that in some sense we are stuck with managing or containing the North Korean nuclear program on the Korean Peninsula, but we can interfere and raise the cost both to North Korea and its customers of the transferal of material, technologies, and so on to other countries. I think that's probably about the best that we can hope from the current sanctions package. The last thing, we should be preparing for the worst. One can imagine a variety of quite frightening scenarios that could develop on the Korean Peninsula without really, invoking sort of bolts from the blue or asteroids or anything else. The thing that's striking to me is that it is my impression that we do not talk enough to the Chinese about these contingencies. It is very easy to imagine scenarios in which the Chinese or the South Koreans get drawn into North Korea. And it is not hard to imagine scenarios in which one of them, for instance, a public health, a super duper version of SARS, sends North Korean refugees spilling into China. The Chinese announce they're moving 10 kilometers in to set up a cordon sanitaire. What do the South Koreans do? I mean, a lot of South Koreans would say as soon as the Chinese start to cross the Tumen River, they send 600,000 troops north. I mean, it's not hard to imagine such scenarios. And it seems to me the really important thing the United States needs to be doing is talking to the Chinese about these contingencies. We want to be very clear what the rules of the road are in terms of the disposition and involvement of U.S. and Chinese forces if we reach those eventualities. Thank you very much. I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Are these microphones now? Is this microphone working? Is it amplifying? Yes. Okay, thank you. Let me just ask each of the presenters a question to initiate the discussion. But let me preface that by sort of two comments two takeaways, as they would say at the Pentagon, that I have from the presentations. First is, what are the realistic expectations that negotiations over the nuclear issues might have with North Korea and Iran? And I think what one common theme, as different as these cases are, as different as these two countries are in their status of their nuclear capabilities, I mean, North Korea has tested, is that the United States can realistically expect to bound the problem, that the rollback is not a realistic objective, in that North Korea is now tested. Iran has mastered the fuel cycle, which the former head of the IAEA, Mohammed al-Baradei, said that any state that's mastered the ability to create fissile material that could be used as a weapon has become a virtual nuclear weapon state. So that with North Korea, picking up on Marcus's final comment, it's about bounding the problem, making sure through deterrence, ensuring that that nuclear materials or components are not transferred beyond North Korean territory, that the uranium enrichment program that was revealed in 2002 is capped, and perhaps trying to roll back some of the plutonium, but we won't get them back to, we won't be able to achieve a complete kind of rollback. With Iran, the question is, what is the Iranian bottom line? It does not seem that any diplomatic resolution that does not allow for uranium enrichment on Iranian soil will be palatable to anyone on the political spectrum in Iran, and that remains as the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate described as sort of the long pole in the tent, that they've mastered the fuel cycle. So that's comment one, that that our expectation should be bounding the problem. Secondly, in terms of creating meaningful pressure or offering some combination of inducements and pressure to affect what Secretary of State Clinton called the calculus of decision last weekend in her appearance on Meet the Press, we are really nowhere without China and Russia. If we don't get Russia on board on Iran, if we don't get China on board with respect to North Korea, we are nowhere. And that really speaks to the necessity of prioritizing. I mean, today there are meetings going on between the United States and China on a range of issues, prioritizing our interests with China and with Russia, where not burning political capital on secondary issues in order to have the ability to get China and Russia on board for the primary issue of concern for us, which are Iran and North Korea. At a conference I was at where they said there'll be no questions, no comments, just questions, and someone went ahead and gave a very long comment. His question was, and my question is, do you agree with me? So I just had asked the speakers to respond, to react to that, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Well, what I do agree with is that Russia is so key towards resolving the Iranian problem. And what I was trying to bring out in my comments is how uncertain each step is in this crisis. President Obama came to office with a new opening to Iran, speaking to them by offering talks without preconditions, and speaking to them while respecting their regime. And there's these catchphrase is mutual respect and justice. So the Obama administration has talked the talk very well. The question is whether they can walk the walk. And to walk the walk, you need to have Russia by your side. And even with the timelines, which I believe have already been pushed back, because I think the United States was originally looking to have sanctions in September, and that the crisis in Iran has realistically made that impossible. And now they're looking, if things don't work out, to kind of up the ante in January. But the Russians, while they say that they want to cooperate, and certainly Obama has tried to link progress on disarmament and missile defense to help on Iran, the Russians are already saying, of course we want to help you, and of course we'll be there if things don't work out. But maybe January is too early, and our timeline is much more extended than that. So our ability to deal with this crisis, our ability to get an international mandate to convince Iran that they're isolated if they don't comply or don't cooperate or don't compromise, is dependent on Russia. And I greatly fear that when the time comes in the fall that we want to move ahead, we're going to find that our Russian ally wants to give Iran more time. And I think that's a great element of uncertainty in this crisis, and I think that it could be a real problem. Thank you.
Well, there are basically two sort of modalities for negotiation with North Korea. The first is the existing six-party talks, which the North Koreans say they will never return to. And the other modality would be bilateral negotiations. And I think in the end, we probably need both. There is a logic for having six-party talks. There are two logics, in fact. One is that there are a lot of interesting and constructive things that can be done in Northeast Asia. And my view of the world, and I don't think it's shared by the State Department, is that we should just continue to have six-party talks whether North Korea shows up or not. And we shouldn't allow the agenda of those talks to be driven by this one, in Northeast Asian terms, relatively small and distinctly peculiar state. I mean, there's lots of business that the United States, China, Japan, South Korea can do constructively that doesn't involve North Korea. And we should just get on with it. And we should leave the door open if the North Koreans want to come back. Then we're happy to have them and talk. But I think that great powers should not allow themselves to be hamstrung by this single individual and, as I say, in these terms, relatively small state. Now, eventually, we're going to have bilateral negotiations with the North Koreans. They made a statement, or I guess a series of statements the last couple of days, suggesting they're interested in that. Without prejudging this, because I'm not a negotiator and I haven't been negotiating with the North Korean government, my impression is that what they would like to do is have bilateral talks in which the United States would acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear power. Then we could have constructive talks about arms reduction, both reducing American nuclear arms as well as North Korean nuclear arms, as well as other military deployments that the North Koreans consider important, such as U.S. Deployments in South Korea and Japan. The North Koreans will probably also might want to talk about the two journalists who they currently have been convicted of various crimes in the North Korean judicial system and are currently residing in a guest house. This is not an agenda that I think any American government would have a great deal of ease accepting. So I think at some point there will be bilateral negotiations, but I think it's going to be a while getting there. In terms of what we would get out of those negotiations, I mean, obviously there's an enormous history of distrust between the two countries, two governments, and there's a historical record that would support that distrust. And I won't go into it any more than that, but simply to say that some of the things that we might consider carrots that we could offer the North Koreans, it's not at all clear to me at this point the North Koreans actually consider them to be carrots. This is a highly insecure government that is extremely risk-averse with respect to the domestic political implications of economic change. So offering them, for example, membership in the World Bank or something is not necessarily something they want. They've in fact shown a preference for carrots taking the form of direct transfers to the government, just direct financial transfers. And maybe we'll find that acceptable, maybe we not. But this sort of kind of engagement story, becoming a, upstanding member of the international community, more prosperous, all that, it's not at all clear to me that this government really sees those as great advantages. The role of China, China's ambivalent. My impression is that within China, there are differences of opinion about how this situation should be handled. There are some within China who like the North Koreans. They see the North Koreans as a useful pawn in their rivalries with the United States and India, as a way of basically engaging in cooperation with Pakistan and a number of fields without direct Chinese involvement. So they see, and it's a fraternally allied socialist state on their border. So they actually like having North Korea around. There are others that probably at this point think that North Korea is not worth it, that the costs that North Korea creates for China are outweighed by the benefits of improved relations with the United States. So China itself is internally conflicted. Finally, ironically, it's North Korea's weakness that actually conveys a certain negotiating leverage. China and South Korea, for that matter, appear to be, in the end, more fearful of an unstable or collapsing North Korea than they do of a stable nuclear-armed North Korea. That is to say, if North Korea possesses a small number of nuclear weapons, but it is not acting in a belligerent way, My guess is at the end of the day, South Korea and China would find that preferable to North Korea collapsing. And so there are limits to the degree of pressure that China and South Korea are willing to place on North Korea, precisely because they fear that excessive pressure could actually provoke a collapse, which would be something worse to them than the status quo.
Very good. Let's open it up now for comments and questions from the floor. We're going to give priority to those who are working on Hill staff people who might be here attending. So, question over there, and there's a microphone coming over. If you could just identify yourself and your office.
Hey, hello. Yeah, my name's Joseph Todd. I'm from Congressman Tanner's office. I've got two questions. The first one is for both of you, and the second one is mainly for Mr. Adler. As we've seen in the past, and as Mr. Noland reminded us, sanctions and even well-regulated ones seem to have little effect. My first question would be, at what point, if any, should the sovereignty of a country be allowed to be overlooked? And secondly, Mr. Adler, could you emphasize the United States supporting an Israeli attack on Iran?
Go ahead, Michael.
I'm not sure what you meant by sanctions affecting the sovereignty of a country.
Actually, I didn't either, so
Yeah.
could you just clarify the question?
Sorry, I'll just speak up. As we've seen, sanctions don't always work. So I'm asking, sanctions don't always work. So I'm asking when the sovereignty of a country should be overlooked, when we should stop looking for sanctions and start taking, I don't know, perhaps military action.
Oh. Well, in the case of Iran, the whole purpose of sanctions and the whole purpose of crippling sanctions would be to avoid having to carry out a military attack. And when you speak to policymakers about this, they say if we don't move strongly on sanctions, the only other alternative is actually to attack. And even on sanctions, there is certainly a point at which they would start to impede on sovereignty. For instance, if there was a trade embargo or if there was a blockade, that could be effectively an act of war. But I think the sanctions they're trying to move towards would be sanctions that would truly limit the ability of Iranian leaders to travel outside their country. I think they might want to see if they can have Iranian students come back, because obviously Iran gets so much of its technology from having people study abroad. And they also might want to try to limit Iran's purchase of gasoline, refined petroleum products, since they lack that and they need that. And other things they might look at would be blocking Iran's ability to buy industrial equipment. So these would be sanctions that would not impede sovereignty, and the goal of those sanctions would be to avoid having to impede sovereignty. Which brings me to your second question about an Israeli, would the United States back an Israeli attack on Iran? That's actually a really, really good question, because as I said in my comments, the Israelis are very concerned that if a deal is struck, it would be allowing Iran to have enrichment. And in Rob's comments about bounding the crisis, it seems to be on one side accepted knowledge that of course they're going to get to keep some enrichment, but how that's going to be done and how acceptable that is to a state like Israel is a real problem. So that's a to-come kind of situation. And once again, the United States is insisting, the United States plus its other negotiating partners, P5+1, are insisting that Iran suspend uranium enrichment. And it's really not clear if Iran is going to do that. So right off, you have a problem with that. And for now, there is no Israeli attack imminent on Iran. I don't think the Israelis are certainly giving the United States and France, Britain, Germany, and Russia and China a chance to try diplomacy. But of course, they're watching it. And then once again, one of the reasons diplomacy is being tried so strongly, even President Obama has said this, is that if things do go to a higher stage of confrontation, you want to make sure that you've tried everything short of confrontation beforehand. And once again, thinking of Russia, the one way to get the Russians to come along on any escalation of the crisis would certainly be to say, we've tried everything else, what else can we do?
I mentioned in my remarks that I thought that the United States government was not articulating its own policy towards North Korea as well as it could. The distinction that I would make, and I think it's really important here, is between sanctions that are meant to punish, change behavior by imposing pain, and sanctions that are simply countermeasures against provocative or offensive behavior. And the sanctions under UN Security Council Resolution 1874 are really defensive in nature. I mean, they don't go after North Korea's leadership, or they don't go after, luxury goods or something in order to punish the leadership. They are directly involved with impeding and disrupting proliferation of missile and nuclear technologies and materials. And I think for that reason, they've received a lot more international support than the earlier set of sanctions. And I think that there's a lot more leeway for very robust enforcement of these, because they can be regarded as really defensive actions against provocative behavior. Military actions against North Korea, well, you never take anything off the table, but I would have to say that would be extremely risky. North Korea has 11,000 forward deployed artillery tubes capable of basically, playing target practice with Seoul. And unless you are really confident that either North Korea would not respond to whatever you did, that it was so targeted that the North Koreans would just sit there and take it, or that your counter battery systems are so good that you could protect Seoul from all that artillery, I think most people would think very long and hard before doing anything on the military side. And besides, there's just a lot of uncertainty about where the assets that you would want to attack are. The North Koreans are experts on tunneling, as the Israelis learned in southern Lebanon. There's actually a lot of cooperation that we haven't talked about. I mean, would we attack North Korea? No, but the Israelis did attack a site in Syria that seems to have been connected to the North Koreans. So there's lots of interesting things going across the talk that we have, or across these countries, that we haven't brought out today. But no, I think one would think very long and hard before direct military action against North Korea.
Yeah, I think with North Korea, we really don't have a target anymore, and with Iran, the estimates have been that it would set back the program 2 years. And the question is, do you want to? It would be the most telegraph punch in history. Do you want to run the risk of initiating a general war with Iran to set back a program 2 years? I mean, that's not buying you much time. Other questions from congressional staff out there? Yes, woman there, right there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Aruj. I'm from Congressman Michael McMahon's office. And thank you so much for coming. And my question is, in Pakistan, how there's an AFPAC strategy, and how you could probably formulate one in regards to North Korea with China being involved, or in the question of Iran having Pakistan or India being involved. If there's any strategy, and you could comment on either one of those two.
I don't quite understand.
So you know how to deal with the crisis in Afghanistan, we have a Pak-Afghan strategy, because you can't deal with the problem in Afghanistan without Pakistani cooperation. So I was wondering, is there any plans to have a similar strategy with North Korea with China's involvement? Because I feel like you need to take account of China in order to fend off the potential attack in North Korea.
Well, the fundamental diplomatic venue for trying to negotiate this problem has been the so-called six-party talks involving China, the United States, North and South Korea, Japan, and Russia, hosted by China. So China is very much, and the United States and China are very much involved together through that mechanism for trying to resolve the problem. And I think we really should be going further. As you recall, the final point I made in my prepared remarks is that a really dangerous eventuality, there are all sorts of dangerous scenarios in North Korea right now involving, anything from public health scenario that I mentioned to things like, splits and factions within the Korean People's Army and the outbreak of civil war. I mean, remember, this is the most militarized society on earth. Virtually every male has military training. it is a society that has a considerable capacity for internal mayhem if things got out of control. And one of the problems is, in that situation, one or more factions appealing for outside support, either from the South Koreans or the Chinese, and then drawing others into some kind of conflict. So my problem is that we haven't gone far enough. Yes, we have the six-party talks, but we really should be talking to the Chinese about these other contingencies. And my impression is that the constraint is on the Chinese side. That until very recently, they have been extremely wary about entering into those sorts of discussions with the United States for fear of offending the North Koreans. My impression is that in the last 6 months or so, as things have seemed to get a little shakier in North Korea, the Chinese are starting to reevaluate their interest in talking to the United States about contingencies on the Korean Peninsula.
Question all the way in the back.
Oh, I'm Dennis Halpin from the Foreign Affairs Committee. I had a question about a debate of the last 10 years with North Korea, or North Korea policy on war of words. You remember when President Bush in his State of the Union address in 2002 referred to North Korea as part of an axis of evil. There was a great outcry in the policy community that using harsh rhetoric about North Korea will drive them away from the negotiating table. And yet, recently, and then, of course, this was part of President Obama's campaign. He said in Strasbourg recently, the U.S. has, in his speech in Strasbourg, used denigrating language. But last week, the Secretary of State publicly referred to North Korea as an unruly child. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. And I would point out at the same time yesterday, on the anniversary of the armistice for the end of the Korean War, North Korea used some pretty harsh rhetoric. But after criticizing Mrs. Clinton this past weekend, the North Koreans indicated they would be coming back to the talks. So my question is, in dealing with North Korea, does the use of harsh rhetoric like axis of evil or unruly children really have a negative effect in negotiations and drive them away, or has that been something that's been overemphasized because they're indicating now they would like to talk bilaterally to the U.S. despite what Secretary of State Clinton said?
At least, unlike a Bush administration official, she didn't refer to him as a pygmy. So,
yes, and as which, as a friend of mine pointed out, was an insult to pygmies. I'm no diplomat, and I didn't stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I'm probably not the right person to answer this question. I think it's probably generally unhelpful to refer to your counterparts in those sorts of ways and use that kind of invective. However accurate it may be, it's probably not wise or constructive. To what extent does it dissuade North Koreans from engaging in negotiations? Well, I suppose that if after the outbreak last week of unruly child versus pensioner and old lady going shopping and so on and so forth, the fact that they seem to be interested in talking suggests that it's not an insurmountable barrier, but it's generally not something I would do. I would also point out that for those of you who are interested, if you really want to read invective, political invective, just check out the North Korean official government news agency. They write the most extraordinary and offensive stuff day after day after day. And it always amuses me a little bit that they then show sensitivity when even mild kind of invective is turned their way. But beyond scoring that kind of debating point, I think it's probably best that everybody stop referring to each other as unruly children, pygmies, war maniacs, human scum, and so on.
woman there from VOA.
My question is for Mr. Adler. I'm Shala Sardigi from Voice of America Persian News Network. I wonder what do you think that Obama administration can do in regards with bringing Russia into cooperation without compromising its own national interest and, for that matter, for their European allies, and to bring into cooperation on Iran's issue?
Well, I think that bringing Russia in and is one of the key parts of the Obama policy. As I said before, Russia is both one of Iran's most important allies. They have a veto on the Security Council, and they have, in a sense, been slowing down the process of sanctioning Iran. So, getting Russia on board is essential. It's part of their policy. They're working very hard on it. Obama, when he was in Moscow earlier this month, certainly tried to get an agreement that once the diplomacy was tried, and if it didn't work out, that Russia would back strong sanctions. I don't think he got the kind of ironclad promise that he wanted, and Russia is certainly holding out, and they will decide what they want to do when the time comes. So they're doing all they can, and so much of the Obama foreign policy is it's an overall comprehensive structure. So the talks on START, the talks on missile defense, which they've overtly said we would not need missile defense if Iran were no longer a concern. This is all to draw in Russia, to get Russia along with the other P5+1 states if they want to crack down more strongly on Iran.
Thank you. Woman over here. David, where was the question?
Carl's in Philadelphia from Senator Martinez's office. Secretary Clinton mentioned crippling sanctions. Now, is it possible to have crippling sanctions if you can't get China and Russia on board? And the last administration worked very hard on getting both China and Russia on board. They have very strong diplomacy. We pushed really hard to get strong sanctions. It just didn't happen. And there's a good possibility that in this administration it probably won't happen. If that is the case, how can we contain Iran after Iran actually has a successful test? Thanks.
It's a great question, and it's a real concern. I think when you speak to people in the administration, they often say the threat of sanctions is more effective than sanctions. But as we've seen in this crisis, the Iranians are concerned about the threat. They were very concerned before 2006 about being referred to the UN Security Council. And this was something they fought tooth and nail. They made great concessions to avoid it. They actually suspended enrichment for 2 years in an effort to avoid that. But then once it happened, once that red line was passed, Iran did very well. And they've managed to exponentially increase the number of the centrifuges they have turning. So I think the concern you state is a very real concern, that when push comes to shove, if it comes to that, we'll have not just Russia, but China, which is a major trading partner and gets a lot of oil from Iran, saying, sure, we will do some sanctions, but that is way too severe. Let's try something a little bit softer first. And that has been the problem, that we thought we could do incremental sanctions. And at this point, certainly the United States, certainly France, certainly Britain want to see not incremental sanctions, but sanctions that really change, sanctions that really change the whole nature of the confrontation. And as you were stating, as I stated in my comments, this could be the Achilles heel of the effort to crack down on Iran.
Can I just add one thing to that? As I mentioned in my original remarks, economic sanctions, the history of economic sanctions is they rarely, if ever, induce governments to reverse core political commitments. The problem with economic sanctions from the standpoint of the sanctioning government is that when you impose an economic sanction, you are telling your citizens not to do something they want to do, namely trade or invest in that other country. And so you immediately create domestic political constituencies to either circumvent, undermine, weaken what you're trying to do. One of the interesting experiences that we've had with North Korea is that while the trade sanctions have been a failure, The one set of sanctions that do appear to have significantly harmed the North Koreans and changed their negotiating position were financial sanctions that were undertaken in 2005 by the United States unilaterally under the Patriot Act. And the reason that it worked differently than the normal trade sanctions case is it essentially inverted that domestic political logic. What happened was the United States identified a small bank in Macau as suspected and engaged in illicit financial behavior. And the problem was, and the result was, the correspondent banks in China with that small bank in Macau, BDA, all, rather than trying to circumvent the sanctions, actually encouraged their governments to implement them. And the reason is they didn't care about North Korea. They had little, if any, business with North Korea, but they cared a lot about their access to the lucrative United States market. And so this was a case in which, and bureaucratically, it was not the foreign ministry trying to do some sort of foreign policy calibration and then persuading the customs administration to implement. This was done basically by the People's Bank of China and the associated financial regulators. Again, they don't care anything about North Korea. They care a whole lot about the United States. And so there may be ways to impose sanctions that have greater degree of effectiveness than others. And I don't know a lot about the particulars of the Iran case, but it seems to me that you would want to think through those sorts of issues very carefully in designing your economic or financial diplomacy.
Let me just add. That's a good point. And actually, the United States has embarked with Treasury on those sorts of financial sanctions. And they certainly will expand them if they decide to increase sanctions. And for the moment, I think Treasury's been told to be put on hold with these sort of sanctions, increasing them because they're already in effect. And that is one of the great hopes, that if Russia and China don't come along, that we can still be able to inflict some damage through cutting off Iranian banks' ability to get loans, the ability to get insurance for trade that they're doing. And then there's also the feeling that the sort of technology that Iran needs comes from the West, and they can't get the technology they need for their oil fields from Russia and China because the Western technology is more advanced. All that said, the sort of international statement which the United States would like to make on Iran depends very much on getting Russia and China to come aboard.
Question here? David, who was the person you were?
I think we're
okay, then we'll go over here, this gentleman here.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Ali Dafrouche. I'm with the National Iranian American Council. My question is for Mr. Adler. You mentioned crippling economic sanctions and certainly the redefined petroleum sanctions. Now, given what we've seen the Iranian people go through for their fight for democracy, can you argue that these sanctions, in a sense, hurt the people of Iran and won't do justice to actually the causes of Iran and I mean the people who are in power right now? And should the United States be concerned for hurting this democratic movement right now through sanctions? Thank you.
Okay, it's a very valid point. The question is, would the Iranians, and I don't think we know how it would turn out, would the Iranians, for instance, if there were sanctions against gasoline and then there were problems domestically in Iran, would the Iranians see this as an opportunity or as a point to rally around Iranian nationalism because the foreigners once again are causing problems in Iran? Or would they say, given the current state of unrest, this is the government that's brought us on this because they have a confrontational policy with the West, and therefore this will even incite us to do more demonstrations? I, for one, don't know which way it would play, and I'm not sure how it would happen, but it's a good point.
I just had a follow-up question for Marcus, who studied kind of economic sanctions. You know, we've made the distinction between general sanctions on the population, which in a country like North Korea, where the regime's already inflicting unbelievable deprivations on the people. But the BDA case that you cite, I mean, where it was targeted, do you see us gaining any possible lever? This is for both questioners, and this will be sort of the closing question. The ability to create meaningful pressure on sort of the core interest groups of the regime through targeted sanctions that could prompt them to the calculus of decision to be affected and a possible change in what you described as sort of a core strategic belief?
Well, one has to assume that following the BDA case, the North Koreans undertook countermeasures and diversified their financial linkages to a greater degree than was the case in 2005. The current set of sanctions under the current UN resolution are doing, in some sense, exactly what you say. They're aimed precisely at the organs within the North Korean state that are involved in nuclear and missile proliferation. And basically, we're now in a game of whack-a-mole. I mean, we're going to go out and target a handful of individuals and front companies. The North Koreans are going to try to reconstitute that network with a new set of shell companies, and we'll go after them. I think what's interesting about the UN sanctions, in some sense, what was left implicit. So far, we're targeting only North Korean entities. The obvious next step is to target the customers, which is allowable under the UN resolution. So I think what one has to, how I would interpret this is a measure that is aimed at disrupting the supply side of those exchanges, with the hope that it is sort of implicitly a shot across the bow of the demand side as well, and that potential customers are going to have second thoughts about getting involved with the North Koreans if they think they could get entangled in these kind of legal issues with the United States and others. Whether that will be, I don't think that's sufficient to terminate or end the North Korean nuclear program. I think it might be effective in significantly impeding or disrupting proliferation.
Well, Iran is a much larger economy, a much more internationally linked economy than North Korea, and Iran is an economy that is desperate for foreign investment. So the tactic certainly will be to cut off means of investment and means of funding, and I think that the Europeans and the Americans feel they can do some damage with that.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Marcus. I'm afraid our time has come to an end for this session. Thank you all for coming today, and in turn, please join me in thanking our speakers for excellent presentations.